All right, so we are going to be talking about the National Sexuality Education Standards. If you're not familiar with the standards, they were created by the Future of Sex Education Initiative, or FOSSE. It's currently a collaborative of Advocates for Youth and SECUS, which is Sex Ed for Social Change. And so Advocates for Youth and SECUS came together along with around 40 other professionals and educators, and they provided input and guidance around this second edition of the standards. The purpose of the National Sexuality Education Standards is to support comprehensive sexuality education in public schools. So we know that sexual health has many health and safety benefits for young people, and it helps young people navigate sexual development and grow into sexually healthy adults. So when we come together to support comprehensive sex ed, it is really in the best interests of students and young people across the country. These standards are meant to provide clear, consistent, and straightforward guidance on the essential minimum core content and skills needed for sex ed that's age appropriate for grades K through 12. It truly is a minimum. So if you're in a population of students that needs more information, that's not conflicting with the standards, but this is what has been shown to be the effective minimum amount of sex ed that young people need. So the standards are intentionally vague, and that allows presenters to decide how much information to give and what activities to use. So especially here in Missouri, that means that these standards are not going to conflict with local control of school boards, administrators, and educators to provide what is best in their community setting. So the National Sexuality Education Standards were first published in 2012, and this second edition was released this spring in March. So around the time that many school districts were shifting to online learning and stay at home here in Missouri is when this second edition came out. So hopefully by getting this introduction today, you have a little bit more information as you're prepping for the fall. So when we look at the National Sexuality Education Standards, you're going to want to know what you're looking at. They are provided in table format, and there's two different types of tables, but in both tables, you will see 7 sexuality education topics, and then each topic has performance indicators, which is what the student should know and be able to do by the specific grade level listed. They're organized by grade level, and they're also coded with the National Health Education Standards. And so each indicator has a code that identifies what topic it addresses, what grade level it is, and then what NHES, so which National Health Education Standard it applies to, and the item number. So if you've never looked at these before, at first it may seem a little confusing, but once you get familiar with these codes, it'll actually be fairly simple to see what you're looking at. There is one major change right off the bat that I want to point out, since this is our introduction to the changes in the second edition, and that is in the second edition, there's an additional grade level. So in the first edition, we had indicators by 2nd, 5th, 8th, and 12th grade, and then in this second edition, they've added 10th grade. And so that's really important because it helps us to understand as educators when we're pulling activities and lesson plans, what is most age appropriate at what grade level. And they included this extra band of grades after much input, especially around the beginning and the early elementary and the high school is where they focused a lot of attention to see if all the standards were in the best, most age-appropriate place. And they determined that they needed to have a split there in high school. So hopefully you'll find that helpful. So you want to see what these health and sexuality education standards look like. So we will flip to, this is just a picture of one page. So when you're looking at this, you can see right there at the top, it says sexual health. So that's the topic area. And then in the black band at the top, those pieces in the grids, those are the National Health Education Standards. So core concepts, analyzing influences, accessing information, interpersonal communication, decision-making, goal setting, self-management. Those are what you would be looking for, and then advocacy. And then underneath, we're looking at the 8th grade standards. It'll be labeled on each page, which band of grade level you're in. And then underneath, then it starts to list the actual indicators. And in this one, we're only looking at indicators that happen to be in core concepts, but as you flip through or you go to the grade level that you're working with, you could have boxes filled in across the grid. It just depends on the topic area and what the indicators are for. So here's one of the big changes. If you are familiar with the National Sexuality Education Standards first edition, you'll know that there were 7 sexuality education topics. But in the second edition, while there are still 7 topic areas, they're actually different than in the first set of standards. So in the first set, we had healthy relationships. In the second edition, it is now consent and healthy relationships. Anatomy and physiology stayed the same, but what was puberty and adolescent development has changed slightly with the addition of the word sexual, because the standards are really focused on sexual development and not adolescent development as a whole, which is adolescent development is a very big topic area and should be covered in a comprehensive health program, but we are talking in these standards just about sexual health. And then in the first edition, we had one category, identity. In this second edition, that has been split into gender identity and expression and sexual orientation and identity. This is a really important shift in this second edition, and it was done in order to show that these two concepts are distinct and should not be misconstrued as the same thing. And they also develop through different age spans of a young person's life. And so they are broken up and then very specifically, of course, given indicators that are age appropriate. And this section is going to be a significant change from the first edition. You'll also see the 6th topic area listed is sexual health. That is a completely new category, and it is a renaming, rebranding of what was pregnancy and reproduction and STIs, STDs, and HIV. So they have combined 2 of the first edition topic areas into one under sexual health. And then personal safety was in the first edition. It has been renamed to interpersonal violence. So if you are using lesson plans and or just a curriculum that is aligned and you have a bunch of coding to the old topic areas, if it doesn't get changed, that's okay. You can still use it, of course, but it would look very different. All right, so the real reason we hosted this webinar today was to give you some insights into how the second edition of the National Sexuality Education Standards is different from the first edition. And there are many important changes that we want to highlight. To be effective, sex education must be medically accurate and cover a broad range of topics, but as they changed to the second edition, it still does that. It still covers skills and is still knowledge and skill based, but they shifted the guiding principles, and in addition to being based on learning theories and strong basis in skills and knowledge, we now include a trauma-informed lens, racial equity and social justice, and health behavior models. So there's a lot of content that is really shifted. The indicators are changed in order to better reflect those concepts. In addition, we already talked about the fact that the 10th grade was added as a new benchmark in the indicators, and that while there are still 7 categories, identity has been split and reproduction and STDs have merged. And so there's 7 categories, the same number of categories, but very different set of topic areas. There are still about the same number of indicators within those 7 topic areas. So in the first edition, there were 160 indicators. In the second edition, there are 166. So there's a couple new ones. Some of them have changed. We're not going to go into all of those specifics today during this 1-hour introduction, but the overall amount of indicators is about equal. And then, of course, to support you in your work, they have updated and improved the tools that go along with the National Sexuality Education Standards. So specifically, the glossary has updated terms for sexual orientation and gender identity. It includes social justice terms, and it has phrases specific to interpersonal violence. So there's a lot of stuff, a lot of good new stuff in this second edition of the National Sexuality Education Standards, and we are going to give you a little bit more information on that. So I'm going to introduce and turn it over to Claire. Claire Antoine is a practicum student with the Teen Pregnancy and Prevention Partnership from Washington University, and they are going to go over some of the big changes in the framework and guiding principles. So thanks for taking over, Claire.
Excellent, Meg, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. So as Meg mentioned, we have a lot of similar frameworks from the previous set of NSES standards. The next slide, please. So here we can see a list of some of the standards that the new NSES are using as frameworks for these benchmarks. So we can see sort of high expectations. The former NSES used high expectations as a way of saying that if students know that we are setting high expectations for them, it's more likely that they're going to try and meet those. And then also, it still relies very much upon functional knowledge and skills. So thinking about skill-based activities and making sure that we use those activities to really cement the learning of the concepts that are listed in some of these standards. Now, the rest of these that you're seeing on the screen, so trauma-informed, social, racial, and reproductive justice and equity frameworks, intersectionality, and language inclusivity are some of the newer frameworks that have been added to the NSES in this newest edition. Meg, next slide, please. So I wanted to highlight the ones that have sort of been updated. So first, just wanted to touch on trauma-informed as a framework, an approach to teaching that recognizes the influence of individual and systemic trauma on students and assesses the implications on instruction and cognition to ensure a safe and supportive learning environment. So really taking into account how a student is coming into a classroom in how we engage with them and how we teach them. An example that's really important that we really wanted to highlight was giving trigger warnings before discussing violent content. There are asterisks in the NSES that sort of notate where it's recommended that a trigger warning be given. And just to clarify, a trigger warning is either a written or a verbal sort of warning that content may be graphic, that it may be upsetting for a student. And normally it includes something like a key word or phrase that indicates the kind of trigger that it may be. So for example, interpersonal violence being one of those triggers that we could bring up before we launch into that topic discussion. Next slide. So the next framework, justice and equity, and obviously this is a very broad set of topics, but social, racial, and reproductive justice and equity lead educators to avoid approaches that marginalize students while strengthening young people's capacity to challenge harmful stereotypes and be inclusive of a wide range of views. So really thinking about a myriad of identities and social justice and equity principles in our teachings so that not only do we create sort of an inclusive environment for the students and one that's more conducive to their learning, but also so that we can teach the students themselves to be more inclusive of their peers who may have different identities from them, and we want to be inclusive of that as well. So example, avoiding heterosexist language that assumes a male-female dichotomy. That is something that has been updated in the new standards. Previously in anatomy and physiology, for example, there were standards that noted that they could potentially, students should be able to dictate the differences between a male, quote unquote, and female anatomy. And now that language has been shifted to be less gendered. So to say that students should be able to properly identify physical anatomy traits. Next slide, please. So then we have intersectionality. And this is a concept that you may or may not be familiar with. It was created by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a legal scholar. It describes the way that overlapping social identities relate to systems and structures of discrimination. So when Kimberly Crenshaw created this theory of intersectionality, she was using it to describe the intersection of Blackness and femaleness. And so that is why the example that you're seeing on the screen here relates to that. So not just facing sexism as a woman, but facing sexism and racism as a Black woman. So really thinking about the ways that our multitude of identities and our students' multiple identities enter a classroom and how that can really impact how they navigate space and experience these topics and or discrimination. And so just being really mindful of that. But intersectionality can also now be used to discuss other intersections of identity. So ability status with adults, maybe talking about veteran status, age, so different identity sets like that. So we can go to the next slide. And here we have language inclusivity, which is sort of tied into all of the previous frameworks that I was just talking about. So using language which does not exclude or alienate students of certain identities, but rather respects each student for those unique identities. So really honoring the differences that we see in the students that they may have in the classrooms with us. An example of this, modeling the use of pronouns and using pronouns that align with student identities. So for example, if I were a student in your classroom, I use they, them pronouns. You may be able to see that on my name on the Zoom screen. And an example would be making sure that you're very consistent in using those appropriate pronouns. So saying something like, I worked with Claire last year. They were in my sexual health education class. So that's an example of a way to use that. And offering your own pronouns. So if you're someone who's say, my name is Sarah and I use she, her pronouns. What are your pronouns? Is a great way to sort of open that door and let students know that you may be a safe person to express that individual piece of themselves with. We can move to the next slide. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Meg so that she can give you more of the specifics about the new standards.
All right, and so before I jump in, Claire, I'm actually going to take a moment to hopefully re-energize our audience here. So again, I appreciate all of you who have joined, and the second half of our presentation is going to dig into some more specific changes around the indicators within the 7 topic areas. But first, we're going to launch a quick poll just to see who is with us in this meeting today. So not sure. Claire, do you have access to our little poll? So we had people from all over sign up for the webinar. I don't know if I know everyone was not able to join us, but if you are able, go ahead and let us know where you're joining us from. And that will actually help me as I am bringing up some of the changes that we see in the indicators as well. All right. I love it. So that is really helpful. It looks like we got a mostly Midwest crew with us today. And then in addition, I love your honesty. Y'all have not looked at these standards, and that is just fine. That's the whole point of today, is that we will look at some of the broad changes together, and then you'll hopefully know where you want to focus your energy. And so, yeah, and especially the maybe person, I understand. A lot of things have come across our inboxes and our screens recently. So if you're not sure, that's perfectly fine. Some of this may ring a bell. So for you all to see, You can see most of us are here in Missouri. I'm in Missouri. Claire, you're still in Missouri, right? And then most of us have not looked at the second edition of the standards. So again, hopefully you're finding this to be helpful as you think about what you want to look at when you log off of this webinar. And so I also want everyone to take just a moment to think about it. The second edition is coming out almost 10 years after the first edition. And so sometimes when we are thinking about like curriculum reviews and new activities, it's like, well, those things don't change. Like we put a lot of effort into creating the very best, and then we roll it out and we get really good at it. And hopefully we're very happy. And when we do evaluations with our students, we see good outcomes. But if we all think about it for a minute, a lot has actually changed in the last 10 years, has it not? And so it probably is about time that the indicators within these topic areas change as well. So I'm gonna ask that everyone on the webinar real fast, if you can think of something that has shifted or changed in sexuality education in the last 10 years that you think should be in these indicators, if you just type it in the chat. And we're gonna brainstorm for just a second. So what has changed in the last 10 years that you would expect to see in this updated National Sexuality Education Standards? Nothing? All right. You all are awake. Great. It's good to see your answers. So technology, acceptance and more integration of students with disabilities, lots more acknowledgement of transgender identities, transgender folks, and then all gender identities too, I think would probably be expected. Sexual identity and orientation, gender fluidity. All right. So you all had ideas. And I'm sure that many of these things were top of mind for the professionals at Advocates for Youth and SECUS, as they were also looking at the old standards and thinking about how they should look now, almost 10 years later. So while we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty of every single change across all indicators, I am going to look at every topic area with you in the next 10 minutes and just give you some overarching themes about what has changed across these different topic areas. So the one that you'll see first here on the screen is consent and healthy relationships. And we know this one has changed right off the bat because the title changed. It used to be just healthy relationships, and now there is a much stronger emphasis on bodily autonomy, consent, as well as boundaries. And so the title has changed and some of the indicators have changed. So consent is addressed very early in the standards. It's the foundation in this category. And there's also a lot more information in this topic area in the indicators about technology and how technology impacts relationships. So you see that in the sample indicator there around social media. This aligns really nicely for the majority of you who are on this call from Missouri with the updates to the Missouri state statute that governs sex ed. That's statute 170.015. It was updated in 2018 to include consent, sexual harassment, and sexual assault. And so the changes in this topic area are gonna align really nicely and give you some guidance as to what is age appropriate and where you could potentially insert those topics into a K through 12 curriculum or classroom setting. So that's an exciting and helpful change. Next, we have anatomy and physiology. So anatomy and physiology, the name isn't changed. The content has changed a little bit, mostly to reflect the more inclusive language that Claire talked about earlier. So more gender inclusive or gender neutral, depending on just how you prefer to discuss it. So an example is one of the indicators says list medically accurate names for body parts, including the genitals, rather than specifying male and female. There are only 5 indicators in this topic area. So if you want to feel really accomplished, like you've fully covered something, this would be one that you should probably look at and you could probably easily tackle, just 5 indicators. It talks about the spectrum of normal and hopefully builds a foundation again for a healthy body image. So this is a very important category, even if it is a smaller one. Next, we have puberty and adolescent sexual development, which we know has a slight name change. It has 10 indicators. They added the sexual development to highlight the fact that these standards are not on development more generally. And we all know a lot is happening in adolescent development over the same age period, so middle school and high school. Certainly not less important, just want to be more focused. You'll see some things that we highlighted, we found noteworthy in this section were that they are scaffolding. So you're going to see scaffolding of concepts even in this section, where younger grades are expected to find credible sources while older grades are expected to identify what is medically accurate. They included an indicator around the role of hormones, which is new to the National Sexuality Education Standards, but actually not new to Missouri grade level expectations. But the National Sexuality Education Standards specifically call out the potential role of hormone blockers on young people who identify as transgender. So something to know that it is in there for your reference. Then we have gender identity and expression, which is essentially a new category. There are many new competencies and terms in this topic area. It has 17 indicators, so a good number. And these standards are also changed to be more gender inclusive. They use less cisgender, less heteronormative language than the original National Sexuality Education Standards. So if these are terms that you are not accustomed to using, you may want to review the standards just to get an idea of what vocabulary is out there. And then there are ways to practice or to get definitions and to update the materials you're using to use those new terms if it's appropriate. The next new category is, again, the second half of the identity, which is now sexual orientation and identity. And this helps us to clearly show to students and young people that sex and gender are 2 distinct ideas, 2 distinct concepts, and they should not be conflated. There are similar concepts to gender identity, but these are specific to sexual orientation. And so again, you'll see indicators that are terminology based, as we show an example here on the screen. We also, again, want to support young people in being healthy, mentally healthy, physically healthy. And so there's indicators that show support as a protective factor. This one is from at the older end of the indicators, the 12th grade band, just as an example of what is in there. This is particularly helpful in this category, or in this topic area, sexual orientation and identity. You might be interested to know there's nothing in the early elementary grades, so nothing for up to 2nd graders to learn in this topic area. It starts in upper elementary, middle school, and high school. And again, that's to show the age appropriateness of the material along with the standards. And then here's our biggest category. So sexual health was formerly pregnancy and reproduction and sexually transmitted diseases and HIV. So this is merging what were 2 big topic areas before into one really big topic area. There are 53 indicators for this topic area by itself. So knowing that there's 166 indicators overall, this is almost a third of our indicators are in this one topic area. For those of you who teach middle schoolers, you are probably not surprised that 8th grade has a really heavy lift in this topic area. So there are more than 12 indicators for the 8th graders to meet, and at least 5 of those are new. So if you're teaching middle school, this might be an area that you want to flip to right away and just see, are they getting the information that they need even earlier in elementary school that they can then build on, and how much do you need to cover in middle school that maybe isn't already being covered. In addition, this category has a lot of the new information about medical technologies. So a specific one that we wanted to highlight was HIV treatment, which has changed a lot. Many people are living with HIV longer and they are healthier in that life. And so we are excited for them. And it's important for young people to have medically accurate information about the treatments that are available for people living with HIV. So that's just one example of medical technology that is included in this category. And then the last category is interpersonal violence, formerly personal safety. This one has 27 indicators, so it's also a relatively big one. Some big changes in this section are that we are really moving towards prevention. And so not focusing on how people who have been impacted by violence should respond, but rather helping young people to identify how to prevent it, to be an upstander, to be a support as a peer. And then also it adds information and indicators about sex trafficking. This is a topic area that there have been organizations, especially in the Midwest, I know here in St. Louis, but across Missouri, have been working on prevention education and prevention strategies around sex trafficking. We didn't have standards really around that, guiding that work before, but I do know that there are resources out there to support these new standards. So if you don't have a sex trafficking addressed in your curriculum, in your program or classroom, and you need help getting those resources, please do reach out, because we want to make connections and help everyone to support young people in learning that is aligned with the standards, is not fear-based, but rather skills-based, and really make sure that this problem is tackled head-on. And so with that, those are the big changes in the 7 topic areas. And then I'm going to turn it over to Claire to finish out with some of the changes and really big highlights in the resources.
Yes, absolutely. So thanks, Meg. So yes, one thing that I was personally really excited to see in the new standards is a fantastic resource, the glossary, which has been updated with several pages worth of new terms and phrases. It is an excellent starting point to better acquaint yourself with words that may be new to you, or even just to brush up on terms you've forgotten so that you can better explain them to others, including the students that you may be teaching. Next slide, please, Meg. So just briefly, I wanted to pick these 3 examples because I felt like they highlighted some of the major changes that I had seen in the standards themselves. And so here we have 3 terms from the glossary. We have safety plan, we have asexual, and we have two-spirit. The reason I selected these is because, as Meg just finished explaining, interpersonal violence is now its own section in the standards. And so the glossary does go into terms that have to do with interpersonal violence prevention. So if that's an area that you feel like you could use a little bit of brushing up on, there are terms in the glossary for you that you can review. Also, asexual and two-spirit, I picked these 2 terms because, again, the standards have really clearly deviated gender and sexuality and sort of separated those so that it's very clear that we should not conflate those 2 concepts. So safety plan, a personalized and practical plan that can help a person in an unsafe relationship know the best way to respond when they are in danger, including but not limited to how to get out of the relationship. This piece is really important, I think, because it highlights the fact that there is an option to exit the relationship And also that they say unsafe relationship. They don't necessarily dictate whether it's a romantic relationship, a friendship, or some other kind of relationship that a student may be having with someone else that may be unsafe. So I like this term from the glossary because it really highlights what we see in the standards themselves, that there are a multitude of relationships that students may be having of various different natures, and they may be unsafe in various different ways. And so we need to sort of equip them with the tools to navigate that. Asexual, a person who does not experience sexual attraction, but may experience other forms of attraction, for example, intellectual and or emotional. And then lastly, but not least, two-spirit, a contemporary umbrella term used by Native, Indigenous, and or First Nations people whose gender identity encompasses both male and female energies. And the other piece of this is that, you know, if you look at a different definition for this, you may see some changes in the language that has to do with two-spirit, but I wanted to include this because it's a pretty solid starting point if you've never maybe heard this particular term before. So again, the glossary is just a really excellent resource. Just flip to the back of it. I highly encourage you to take a quick look and see if there are any terms that you could brush up on or terms that might be new to you. So Meg, I will turn it back over to you to talk about the last page of these resources.
Yeah. Claire and I have had many discussions about this second edition, and we thought it was worthwhile, though maybe a little bit funny, to bring up the glossary because we don't often get excited about the glossary, but we hope you will actually flip all the way to the back and check out the glossary. It clearly was very intentional in the way they updated that as well. And so I do want to make sure everyone can access all of the resources and standards. And so we have all of the links within this slide. So we are going to go ahead and share the slides in PDF form. So they'll have the hyperlinks. And then we will also make the recording available to you all after this in case there's something that you want to go back and look at. But just so you know, the National Sex Education Standards are available for you to download for free at any point. They are easily accessible online. They are also accompanied by many other resources. So if you are reviewing a program or a curriculum, I would highly recommend looking at the Health Education Curriculum Assessment Tool, HECAT. The National Sexuality Education Standards are in most ways aligned with the HECAT. You also can access those national health education standards, especially if sexual health is just one part of the health education that you're teaching. And then if you are new or have not reflected on your own preparations for teaching sexuality education in the recent past, I also highly recommend looking at the Professional Learning Standards for Sex Ed. Those are fairly new. They came out last year. And it includes a self-assessment tool that's pretty short. It will not take you very long, but that will help you to identify areas of your professional development that you might want to improve or increase before the fall or as you are getting into classrooms and working with young people. And there are many resources, both online and through the Teen Pregnancy and Prevention Partnership, to help you with your professional learning to prepare you as you are facilitating sex ed. In addition, this is just an introductory webinar. The Teen Pregnancy and Prevention Partnership did a lot of work before I was even part of the organization to provide trainings on the National Sexuality Education Standards. So we started providing those trainings back in 2013, and we are updating and revising those trainings for this fall. So if you need more than just an introduction, if you would really like to dig into the standards and look at how they align with Missouri Health GLEs, so grade level expectations, as well as get ideas for activities and lesson plans that fit with these updated second edition National Sexuality Education Standards, look for announcements about those training opportunities. They will be coming up in the next couple months. We will roll them out by grade level, and they will be virtual in order to adapt to the current public health situation and protect your safety, but also allow you to access those trainings and resources from anywhere. And so with that, we have a good 15 minutes. If anyone has questions, comments, anything you all want to add or ask before we end the webinar. So you are welcome to put those comments, questions in the chat. We are also more than happy to unmute you if you would like to speak up. All right. I see, Sean, thank you for adding the link also in the chat. So that is directly available to you all. And if you're looking, I see Jeanette, you're looking for a new curriculum. These are great guidance as you're reviewing curriculums. Also, I would encourage you, if you are able to join us for trainings in the fall, we will dig into some samples of curriculums, hopefully to help you out. And then Claire has put in the chat all of those links. So if there was one that you particularly wanted to open right away, you can go ahead and click on one of those. We were excited to get to share this information with you. Never thought I'd get excited about the glossary, but certainly am. So I appreciate you all sharing our enthusiasm and your time. And Amber says she's excited to be a part of this work as a recent college graduate, and she remembers learning these terms, so it's great to see it being used. It is nice, right, to see learning theories and all of the standards coming into practice. We hope that these standards will not sit on a shelf, but that we will pull them out and use them as part of our planning processes together. And I have put up on the screen the contact information for TPPP. So if you do need anything related to these standards or any aspect of sex ed, we certainly want to support you. You can reach out directly, or you can access many of our resources through our website and our social media pages. We are going to go ahead and stop the recording, and then again, if you have any questions that did not get answered,